Welcome in, everyone. Today's deep dive is going to be epic. We're tackling Roman history from those scrappy beginnings to a full-blown empire. You sent over a ton of fascinating sources, so let's jump right in.
It's always amazing to me how Rome's story, even its foundation myth, still captures our imagination.
Okay, so Romulus and Remus, abandoned twins, raised by a she-wolf, destined to found Rome. It's a wild tale. Was it all made up, or is there some historical truth buried in there?
That's the million sesterces question. Even ancient historians debated that. What's more important is what this myth tells us about Roman identity. They saw themselves as descendants of Mars, the god of war, fierce, destined for greatness.
It's giving chosen people vibes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of rulers, you've got Romulus as the first king, then a whole line of them, and then Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Coincidence?
A striking one, isn't it? Almost like the empire came full circle. But between those two Romulus figures lies a complex story of kings, republics, conquests, and cultural clashes. Did you know that those early kings weren't just warlords? Numa Pompilius, for example, is credited with establishing many of Rome's religious institutions and legal codes. Talk about a legacy.
It's amazing how these early decisions echoed through centuries. But how did Rome go from kings to a republic in the first place? It feels like a pretty radical shift.
It was. In 509 BCE, the Romans decided they'd had enough of monarchy, overthrew their last king, and established a republic. Now, this doesn't mean everyone was suddenly equal. You had patricians, the wealthy elite, and plebeians, the common folk, constantly vying for power. Think of it like a constant tug of war within the government.
Ah, so that's where the terms patrician and plebeian come from.
Right.
It's like those social divisions were baked right into their system.
Exactly. And this tension between different groups, the patricians and plebeians, the Senate, which was like their advisory council, and ambitious generals, this becomes a recurring theme throughout Roman history. But before we get to that drama,
We got to talk about how Rome went from a city-state on 7 hills to, well, I'm seeing a lot about the Punic Wars in these sources. Was this like their make-or-break moment?
it was a clash of titans. Imagine Rome, this rising power going head-to-head with Carthage, a North African empire that controlled much of the Mediterranean trade. It was a fight for dominance, and it got brutal.
And enter Hannibal. This guy wasn't messing around crossing the Alps with elephants. It's almost comical to imagine, but incredibly brilliant at the same time. Why was that such a game changer, strategically speaking?
Think about it. The Romans expected attacks from the south by sea. Hannibal completely flipped the script. He marched his army, including war elephants, over the freaking Alps. It was unheard of. This bold move caught the Romans off guard, and for a while it seemed like Hannibal might actually win. He inflicted some devastating defeats on the Romans, which really shook their sense of invincibility.
Wow, that's incredible. It makes you realize that even the mightiest empires can be vulnerable.
Yeah.
But Rome eventually bounced back, right?
They did. The Punic Wars raged on for decades, but ultimately Rome emerged victorious, destroying Carthage and becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean. But these victories came at a cost.
Oh, what kind of cost?
Well, for one, the constant warfare took its toll on Roman society. Small farmers, the backbone of their army, were forced to sell their land, leading to a rise in the gap between the rich and the poor. And then there's the human cost. Countless lives lost, both Roman and Carthaginian. It's a reminder that victory often comes at a steep price.
It's almost like every triumph contained the seeds of a new challenge. And speaking of challenges, one name keeps popping up as we move into the later years of the Republic. Julius Caesar. This guy was ambitious, to say the least.
Caesar is where things get really interesting. He was a brilliant general, a shrewd politician, and some would say a ruthless opportunist. His rise to power, his conquest of Gaul, which is modern-day France, and his eventual clash with the Roman Senate, it's a story of ambition, betrayal, and political maneuvering that rivals any Shakespearean tragedy.
It's giving Game of Thrones and togas, for sure. But Caesar's story ends in assassination, right? What if he hadn't been killed? How would Roman history be different?
Ah, the ultimate what-if of Roman history. It's impossible to say for sure, but Caesar's death was a turning point. It ushered in a period of civil war and ultimately paved the way for the Roman Empire, with his adopted son Octavian, later known as Augustus, taking center stage.
It sounds like we're about to enter a whole new era of Roman history. One filled with emperors, gladiators, and those grand structures we still marvel at today.
We are. But before we dive into the grandeur and drama of the Roman Empire, it's important to remember that this transition wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Rome had been fundamentally changed by its conquests, its internal struggles, and the legacy of figures like Caesar. So you're about to enter Rome's Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity within the Roman Empire. It lasted for about 2 centuries, and during this time, the Mediterranean practically became a Roman lake.
It's funny how the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it seems like they really hit their stride during the Pax Romana. All those incredible structures, the emperors, the sprawling empire, feels like the Rome we see in movies.
It's certainly when Rome's power and influence reached its zenith. But as with everything, it's important to look beyond the glamorous facade. Augustus Caesar's heir was a shrewd ruler. He understood that after decades of civil war, what people craved most was stability. So he cleverly consolidated power while maintaining a veneer of republican tradition. He even rejected the title of dictator, which Caesar had held, opting instead for the more palatable princeps, meaning first citizen.
That's fascinating. He was playing the long game, projecting an image of continuity while completely reshaping the political landscape.
Exactly, and it worked. With stability came economic growth. Trade flourished thanks in part to those famous Roman roads, a network so extensive and well-built that it connected the farthest reaches of the empire to its beating heart in Rome.
Talk about infrastructure. The roads, the aqueducts, the Colosseum Roman engineering was light years ahead of its time. I mean, did you see that documentary about how they built those massive structures without modern technology? Mind-blowing.
It's a testament to their ingenuity and organizational skills. Those aqueducts, for example, weren't just impressive feats of engineering. They provided a constant supply of fresh water to Rome's burgeoning population, essential for public health and sanitation. The Romans understood that a healthy and well-maintained city was crucial for a thriving empire.
It's fascinating to see how these practical concerns went hand in hand with artistic and cultural achievements. But one thing I'm grappling with is this idea of the Pax Romana as a golden age. While it brought peace and prosperity, was it truly a golden age for everyone? The sources mention a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and even slave revolts during this time.
That's a crucial question, and the answer is complex. While the Pax Romana brought undeniable benefits to many, it was not a utopia. The wealthy elites certainly prospered, but the lives of the poor, and especially slaves, remained brutally difficult. The slave revolts you mentioned, like the one led by Spartacus, are stark reminders of the simmering discontent that existed beneath the surface of Roman society. Even during this period of relative peace and prosperity, there were those who struggled and suffered.
And let's not forget the pressure of maintaining such a vast empire. Defending those borders from constant threats must have been a logistical and financial nightmare.
It was a constant balancing act. Rome's legions were renowned for their discipline and effectiveness, but maintaining such a large and far-flung military force required enormous resources. The empire was constantly on guard against threats from the north, the east, and within its own borders.
So amidst all this, Roman culture flourished. We see a fusion of Roman and Greek influences in everything from art and literature to philosophy and religion. Was this cultural exchange a deliberate policy or more of a natural consequence of conquest?
It was a bit of both. The Romans had a deep respect for Greek culture, and they actively sought to incorporate elements of it into their own. But it was also a case of, as the saying goes, when in Rome. As the empire expanded, it absorbed a wide range of cultures and traditions. This cultural blending contributed to the richness and diversity of Roman art, literature, and philosophy.
We can't talk about the Roman Empire without mentioning the emperors themselves. From Augustus to Nero to Marcus Aurelius, each left their mark on history. What I find fascinating is the sheer range of personalities and leadership styles. You have your good emperors, your bad emperors, and then you have Caligula.
Ah, Caligula. Now, there's a name that's synonymous with imperial excess and cruelty. Historians still debate the extent to which the stories about him are true, but one thing's for sure, he was a far cry from rulers like Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. His reign, though short, was marked by paranoia, extravagance, and shocking acts of cruelty.
It's amazing how, even after all these centuries, those personalities still jump out at us. You get a real sense of how different their leadership styles were, and how those differences impacted the empire during their reigns. But even with periods of great leadership, no empire lasts forever. What about the factors that led to Rome's decline? Was it a sudden collapse or more of a slow unraveling?
It was a complex process that unfolded over centuries. Think of it like a once mighty tree slowly succumbing to a combination of diseases and pests. Political instability was a major factor. Constant power struggles, assassinations, emperors rising and falling like dominoes. It creates a climate of uncertainty and fear which erodes the foundations of any society.
And if I remember correctly, this is where we start seeing those barbarian invasions becoming more frequent and impactful. Were these outside forces the nail in the coffin for the Roman Empire?
They certainly played a significant role. As Rome's internal stability wavered, external threats grew bolder. We're talking about Germanic tribes, the Huns under Attila groups, putting immense pressure on the empire's borders, weakening its defenses. But to say it was only the barbarians would be an oversimplification. Rome's problems ran much deeper.
Our sources mention something about economic troubles and even a devastating pandemic. It's hard to imagine something like that happening on such a massive scale. Tell me more about these internal pressures that were weakening the empire from within.
Well, imagine this. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, ripped through the empire in the 2nd century, killing millions. It's difficult to overstate the impact of such a pandemic. It disrupted trade, weakened the military, and created widespread fear and instability. It's a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires are vulnerable to forces beyond their control.
It's one thing to read about it, but I can only imagine the fear and uncertainty people must have felt. This really highlights how vulnerable even the most powerful empires can be to something like a pandemic. It's a sobering thought.
Indeed. And these external threats, combined with the plague, exacerbated existing problems within Roman society. The economy, already strained by constant warfare and lavish spending, began to falter. Inflation, sword trade declined, and the gap between the rich and the poor grew wider.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. And this is where figures like Diocletian and Constantine enter the picture, right? They tried to implement reforms to salvage the situation. What were their strategies for dealing with these immense challenges? So here we are, standing on the precipice of a pivotal moment in history, the Western Roman Empire crumbling under the weight of its own internal struggles and external pressures. What was it like to witness the fall of such a dominant force? Was it a dramatic crash or more of a slow fade into obscurity?
It was less of a dramatic collapse and more of a gradual disintegration. Think of a grand mosaic slowly losing its tiles one by one until the picture it once depicted becomes unrecognizable. By the 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its armies weakened, its treasury depleted, its leadership in turmoil. The barbarians who had once been held at bay were now encroaching on all sides, sacking cities and toppling emperors.
And then in 476 CE, a man named Odoacer, a Germanic general, deposes the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. It's almost hard to believe that this relatively obscure event marked the end of an era. What's the story behind this final act?
It's almost ironic, isn't it? Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, and Romulus Augustulus, the emperor who presided over its fall. It's a historical coincidence ripe with symbolism, but in reality, Odoacer's coup was more of a formality than a turning point. The Western Roman Empire had been on life support for decades, and its demise was a foregone conclusion. Odoacer himself even recognized the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. It was a symbolic end to a long and complex process.
So while the Western Roman Empire fell, the eastern half lived on as the Byzantine Empire. What allowed them to weather the storm when the West couldn't? It's fascinating how they managed to hold on for another 1,000 years, carrying the torch of Roman legacy.
Their survival is a testament to their resilience, their strategic location, and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was strategically located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. This gave them a distinct advantage in terms of trade and defense. They also benefited from a more unified political structure and a stronger sense of cultural identity.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if the Western Roman Empire had adopted similar strategies. Could they have averted their fate, or was their decline inevitable?
That's one of history's great what-ifs. Perhaps if they had reformed their government, stabilized their economy, or addressed the widening social gap, their fate might have been different. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20.
It's easy to focus on the fall, but it's equally important to remember what the Romans achieved during their time. Their innovations in engineering, law, language, and art left an indelible mark on Western civilization. What do you think is their most enduring legacy?
That's a tough one. Their legal system was remarkably advanced for its time, and its influence can still be seen in many modern legal codes. Their architectural achievements, like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, continue to inspire awe and wonder. But perhaps their most enduring legacy is their language, Latin, which became the foundation for many Romance languages spoken today. It's a testament to the power of ideas and their ability to transcend time and borders.
Speaking of transcending time, if you could go back and give one piece of advice to a Roman emperor at any point in their history, what would it be and why?
That's a thought-provoking question. Perhaps I'd advise them to focus on unity and stability, to bridge the gap between rich and poor, and to remember that empires built on conquest alone are often built on shaky ground.
Wise words. It seems we can learn a lot from the Romans, both from their triumphs and their failures. Their story is a reminder that even the most powerful empires are not invincible, and that the choices we make today shape the world we leave behind for future generations.
Well said.